let us move on to the types of budget. There are two main types of budget. One is balanced budget and the other one is unbalanced budget. So from the word balanced, you can understand that there is a balance of government expenditure and revenue. So the government expenditure is equal to the government revenue. So when the expenditure is equal to the revenue, we call it as balanced budget. Whereas when there is an imbalance, when the expenditure exceeds the revenue, we call it as unbalanced budget. So this unbalanced budget, either the expenditure might be more than the revenue or the revenue might be more than the expenditure. So in that case, there are two types of balanced budget. One is surplus budget and the other one is deficit. So surplus budget, it means there is excess. So the revenue is greater than expenditure of the government. So when the revenue is more than the expenditure of the government, we call it as surplus budget. Whereas the expenditure, when the expenditure exceeds the revenue of the government, then we call it as deficit budget. Now let us move on to the different types of deficits in budget. When there is a surplus budget, there is no issue for the government, and when there is a balanced budget, it is favorable for the government. Whereas when there is a deficit budget, the government has to resort to borrowing. Now let us discuss the different types of deficit budgeting. Types of deficits in government budget. There are three types of deficits in government budget: revenue deficit, primary deficit and fiscal deficit. So let us first discuss revenue deficit. Revenue deficit refers to the excess of total revenue expenditure over total revenue receipts. So the formula is revenue deficit is equal to total revenue expenditure minus total revenue receipts. This total revenue receipts comprises of tax revenue plus non-tax revenue receipts. Total revenue expenditure minus total revenue receipts is revenue deficit. The next is the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit refers to the excess of total expenditure over the sum of revenue receipts and non-debt capital receipts. Fiscal deficit is otherwise total budget expenditure minus revenue receipts minus non-debt capital receipts. Then what is non-debt capital receipt? Non-debt capital receipt does not lead to liability. It does not create liability. For example, disinvestment. Now, non-debt, it means it does not create liability, it's not a debt. As it is not a debt, the government need not pay back. At the same time, if it is a borrowing, the government has to repay. So here, as it is non-debt capital receipt, the government need not pay back the money, need not pay the interest. So that is why we call it as non-debt capital receipt. So fiscal deficit is otherwise total budget expenditure minus revenue receipts minus non-debt capital receipts. Total budget expenditure is otherwise revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure, together we call it as total budget expenditure. Now the other formula for fiscal deficit is revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure minus total receipts net of borrowings. It means total receipts is nothing but revenue receipts and capital receipts. Net of borrowing is excluding borrowing. So when you exclude borrowing, then you get what is called as total receipts net of borrowing. And I can give you one more formula for fiscal deficit is equal to borrowing. Fiscal deficit is otherwise borrowings. The last one is the primary deficit. Primary deficit is the difference between fiscal deficit and interest payment. So it is otherwise primary deficit is equal to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Implications of revenue deficit. It signifies that government will not be able to meet its revenue expenditure fully from its revenue receipts. So when it is not able to meet the revenue expenditure from the revenue receipts, it leads to deficit. It means that the current expenses are greater than the current income. Expenditure is greater than the income of the government. Income is here the receipts. The bulk of these expenses is interest payment, wages for government employees and defense personnel, and other expenses. Implications of fiscal deficit. It means that to meet the expenditure, government has to resort to borrowing. It shows how government is living beyond its means. So beyond its means is whatever receipts the government gets, more than that is the expenditure. Higher fiscal deficit is a sign of fiscal indiscipline, particularly when there is inflationary spiral in the country. So this leads to higher price in the economy and it leads to high interest. It is totally an inflationary spiral. Implications of primary deficit. It indicates borrowing requirement of the government on account of the excess of current year expenditure over current year receipts when interest payments for the past loans are not accounted for. So we calculate primary deficit from fiscal deficit. When we subtract interest payment, we derive at primary deficit. It thus indicates the extent to which the government needs to borrow to implement its budgetary programs and policies for the year ahead. Government needs money to just implement all these programs. So programs for education or other policies, for all this government needs money.